In the shadow of the painted mountains, where the western wind carried tales of both hope and heartbreak, they said the Iron Riders feared no one. They'd blazed a trail of terror across 3 territories, leaving broken dreams and empty homesteads in their wake. But they never expected their downfall would begin with a simple farm girl from Willow Creek, a girl whose steady hands could thread a needle by candlelight or put a bullet through a silver dollar at 300 yards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Ruby Harper wiped sweat from her brow, her calloused hands gripping the handle of a worn pitchfork. At 22, she had already spent more years working this land than most folks twice her age. The early summer breeze carried the sweet scent of wildflowers, mixing with the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil. This particular morning felt different somehow, quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ruby paused her work to survey the family farm. The old barn needed a fresh coat of paint, its weathered boards telling stories of storms weathered and seasons past. The chicken coop her father had built still stood strong, though the wire mesh was starting to sag in places. She made a mental note to repair it before the weather turned. These days, it seemed there was always something that needed fixing, something that reminded her of all they'd lost when Jedediah Harper was taken from them. "Rose, the chickens are loose again," Wesley's voice rang out from behind the barn. Her 14-year-old brother came running, his sandy hair tousled by the wind, looking so much like their father, it made her heart ache. "Mrs. Peterson's going to have our heads if they get into her vegetable patch one more time." Ruby couldn't help but smile at the panic in his voice. She propped the pitchfork against the barn wall, brushing dust from her worn overalls. "Well then, you better help me round them up before she notices." The siblings spent the next few minutes corralling the escape artist chickens, their laughter echoing across the farmyard. Felt good to hear Wesley laugh. Those moments had been rare in the 3 years since their father's death. Once the last bird was safely back in the coop, Wesley's eyes lit up with that familiar, mischievous glint. "Hey, Rose, I've been practicing with that old slingshot," he announced proudly, pulling the handmade weapon from his back pocket. "Bet I can hit more targets than you now." He held up the slingshot, a piece of craftsmanship their father had helped him make just months before he died. Ruby raised an eyebrow, remembering their father's words about staying humble. The memory was crystal clear. Jedediah Harper standing in the dawn light, adjusting her grip on his prized rifle, whispering, "Pride makes a target of itself, Ruby Rose. Better to be underestimated and overlooked." "Oh, really?" she asked, playing along with her brother's challenge. "And what makes you so sure about that, little brother?" Wesley was already gathering tin cans from behind the tool shed, his movements quick and purposeful. "Because I've been practicing every day, just like Pa taught us. Come on, I'll show you." He began arranging the cans along the fence post, each one carefully spaced. "We'll take turns, 5 shots each. Whoever hits the most wins." "And what exactly am I supposed to use?" Ruby asked, maintaining her act. "Since you've got the only slingshot." Wesley's face fell for a moment before brightening again. "Wait right here." He disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with their father's old hunting rifle. The weapon was a Winchester Model 1873, lovingly maintained despite its age. "You can use this. It's only fair since you're older and all." Ruby's heart skipped a beat at the sight of the familiar weapon. If Wesley only knew how many hours she'd spent with that very rifle, practicing in secret during those precious early morning hours before the rest of the family woke. How many times she'd slipped away to the hidden clearing behind the north pasture, where the rising sun painted the targets in golden light as she worked to perfect her father's teachings. "I don't know, Wes. Mama wouldn't like us using Pa's gun." She hesitated, though her fingers itched to hold the weapon that had become like an extension of herself. "Please? I promise we'll be careful, just like Pa taught us." His eager eyes wore down her resistance, just as they always did. In so many ways, Wesley was the spitting image of their father. Same determined chin, Same unwavering spirit. All right. But just this once, she conceded, taking the rifle with practiced ease that she carefully masked as uncertainty. The familiar weight of it brought back a flood of memories. Dawn practices with her father, his patient instruction, the pride in his eyes when she'd hit her first distant target. Wesley took his position, tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. His first stone missed completely, causing a few nearby birds to scatter. The second clipped the edge of a can, making it wobble but not fall. His third was a solid hit, sending the can flying. The fourth and fifth shots both missed, leaving him with a single hit out of 5 attempts. Not bad, Ruby encouraged, noting how his stance had improved. That's better than last time. Pa would be proud of how you're coming along. Your turn, Wesley said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. Don't feel bad if you can't hit any. Pa always said rifles are trickier than slingshots. Ruby lifted the rifle, deliberately making her movements appear slightly awkward. She let her first shot go wide, watching Wesley's grin widen. The second shot also missed, though not by quite as much. Then, making a show of taking extra time to aim, she allowed herself to hit the next 3 cans in quick succession, each shot placed perfectly center. That was amazing, Wesley exclaimed, his jaw dropping. How did you do that? Just got lucky, I suppose, Ruby shrugged, quickly lowering the rifle. Must be Pa watching over me. She tried to ignore the twinge of guilt at the deception, but their father's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes keeping your skills hidden is as important as having them. Their moment of levity was interrupted by the distant sound of hooves approaching along the main road. Ruby instinctively moved between Wesley and the noise, her grip tightening on the rifle. But it was only Mr. Fletcher, the town's banker, riding past their farm on his way to Willow Creek. His usually pristine suit was covered in trail dust, and his face carried a weight she'd never seen before. You kids be careful out here, he called out as he passed, reining his horse to a stop. Word is the Iron Riders hit another town just 2 days' ride from here, took everything they could carry and left 4 good men dead. Clayton Hawkins himself was seen leading the raid. The banker's voice dropped lower, heavy with meaning. They say he's working his way this direction. The mention of the Notorious gang cast a shadow over the bright morning. Ruby's jaw tightened as she watched Mr. Fletcher continue down the road toward town. The Iron Riders had been pushing steadily closer to Willow Creek for months now, testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before meeting resistance. Their leader, Clayton Hawkins, had earned his fearsome reputation through a combination of ruthless efficiency and calculated cruelty. Wesley, help me get these morning chores finished up, Ruby said, her voice steady despite the chill that had settled in her bones. I need to make a supply run into Willow Creek before noon. As she walked back to the barn to store their father's rifle, Ruby's mind wandered to the hidden clearing where she practiced her shooting each dawn, just as Jedediah Harper had taught her. She thought about the Iron Riders and their reputation for breaking not just bodies, but spirits. They were coming. That much was certain. The only question was when. Ruby ran her fingers along the rifle's worn stock before placing it back in its hiding spot. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from memory. Remember, Ruby Rose. True strength lies not in the power to inspire fear, but in the courage to stand against it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Willow Creek was a collection of weather-beaten buildings strung along a single dusty main street. What had once been a promising frontier settlement now showing signs of worry and wear. The late morning sun beat down on false front buildings that stood a story taller than they actually were, an attempted grandeur that fooled no one. Ruby guided her horse past the livery stable, noting how the usually busy hitching posts were only half full. People were staying home more these days, she realized. Fear had a way of emptying streets. Sheriff Leland Burke stood in front of his office, apparently fascinated by something in the distance. He barely acknowledged Ruby's greeting, his hand nervously adjusting the badge that seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. Everyone knew he'd only taken the job because no one else wanted it after the last sheriff left town, and it showed in every hesitant movement he made. The bell above Clara Winter's general store announced Ruby's arrival, and the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeted her. Clara looked up from her ledger, her round face creasing into a warm smile. "Ruby, dear, your usual supplies?" "Yes, ma'am, and some extra coffee if you've got it. Mama says the old tin's almost empty." Ruby began gathering her items, noting how the store's shelves seemed somehow sparse compared to her last visit. As Clara tallied up her purchases, other customers filtered in and out of the store. A group of women huddled near the fabric section, their whispered conversations carrying just enough for Ruby to catch fragments. "Fourth town this month? Sheriff won't even talk about it. Just a matter of time before they come here." The bell chimed again, and a weather-beaten man Ruby didn't recognize entered, pulling a small cart laden with goods. His clothes were travel-stained, and his eyes carried the weary look of someone who'd seen too much of the world's darker side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, removing his hat. "Name's Jeremiah Tucker, traveling peddler. Got some fine goods to trade if anyone's interested." He began unpacking his cart, but his next words froze everyone in place. "Though I should warn you, prices might be going up soon. Just came through Copper Canyon, or what's left of it." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "Copper Canyon? But that's less than 2 days' ride from here." Tucker nodded grimly. "Iron Riders paid them a visit 4 days ago, took everything worth taking, burned what wasn't. Sheriff tried to stand up to them." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Well, they're looking for a new sheriff now." The store erupted in worried murmurs. Ruby felt eyes turning toward her, some pitying, others dismissive. She heard someone whisper, "Just like what happened to Jed Harper," and her hands clenched into fists. "Someone ought to do something," Tucker continued, arranging his wares. Then he glanced at Ruby with what seemed like genuine kindness, though his words stung. "But I suppose that's not the concern of a farm girl like yourself, miss." Ruby paid for her supplies quickly, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of fear and judgment. But as she stepped out onto the street, a familiar voice called out to her. "Ruby? Wait up!" Eleanor Harper hurried from the dressmaker's shop where she took in sewing work to help make ends meet. Her face was drawn with worry. "I heard about Copper Canyon. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Mama, I'm just getting supplies, that's all." "I know that look in your eyes, Ruby Harper. It's the same one your father had." Eleanor's voice caught. "We already lost him to those animals. I can't lose you, too." The mention of her father sent Ruby's mind back to that terrible day 3 years ago. She'd been 19, watching from behind the barn as Jedediah Harper confronted 3 men trying to steal their horses. He'd been fast, but they'd been faster. The sound of those gunshots still echoed in her nightmares. "I promise to be careful, Mama," Ruby said softly, hugging her mother. But they both knew she hadn't promised what Eleanor had actually asked. As she secured her supplies to her saddle, Ruby noticed Deputy Caleb Tucker leaning against the post office wall, practicing his quick draw when he thought no one was looking. His movements were clumsy, unpracticed. She remembered her father's words about proper technique, how he'd spent hours teaching her the right way to clear leather without catching the hammer. The deputy's gun caught in his holster and he cursed softly. Ruby couldn't help herself. "You're gripping too tight," she said quietly, causing him to start. "Makes your hand shake when you draw." Deputy Tucker's face reddened. "Miss Harper, I didn't see you there." He holstered his revolver, embarrassed to be caught practicing. "About what happened at your farm last month. I wanted to help when those drifters caused trouble, but the sheriff said—" "I know," Ruby cut him off. The young deputy meant well, but good intentions wouldn't stop the Iron Riders. She'd handled those drifters herself, though no one knew it was her warning shot that had sent them running. As she mounted up to head home, she caught sight of old Silas McCready watching her from his gunsmith shop. The old man's eyes were sharp despite his advanced years, and something in his gaze made Ruby wonder if he saw more than others did. She'd caught him studying her once when she was buying ammunition, his weathered face thoughtful as she selected exactly the right caliber for her father's rifle. The ride home gave Ruby time to think. The Iron Riders were coming. That much was certain. Clayton Hawkins wouldn't leave a town as prosperous as Willow Creek alone, not when he'd already worked his way through the surrounding settlements. When they came, Sheriff Burke would probably just hand over his badge, hoping surrender would spare the town the worst of their violence. But Ruby knew better. She'd seen the aftermath of the Iron Riders' idea of mercy. They didn't just take money and valuables, they took hope itself, leaving broken communities in their wake. Her father had died trying to protect what was his. Now it fell to her to protect what was left. The sun was high overhead when she reached the farm, casting short shadows across the yard. Wesley was practicing with his slingshot again, his face set in concentration. Ruby watched him for a moment, seeing their father in his determined stance. She needed to keep him safe, keep them all safe. But to do that, she might have to reveal what she'd spent 3 years carefully hiding. The weight of her decisions settled around her shoulders as heavy as a winter coat. Sometimes, she reflected, the hardest part of being strong wasn't in knowing how to fight. It was in knowing when to stop hiding. The dust cloud Ruby had spotted the previous evening materialized into something far worse than anyone in Willow Creek could have imagined. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when the first sounds of approaching horsemen reached the town. The steady drumbeat of hooves against packed earth grew louder with each passing moment, like distant thunder rolling ever closer. Clayton Hawkins and his Iron Riders appeared first, as dark silhouettes against the rising sun, a technique they'd perfected to strike fear into the hearts of their victims. As they drew closer, details emerged from the dust and shadow. 15 riders spread across the width of the street, their horses moving in perfect unison. At their center rode Hawkins himself, a tall figure whose very posture seemed to radiate casual menace. The town had gone eerily quiet. Shopkeepers who'd been opening their stores for the day froze in their tracks. A woman hurriedly pulled her playing children inside. Even the usual morning birdsong had fallen silent, as if nature itself held its breath. From her position in the shadows between Clara's general store and the cobbler's shop, Ruby watched as Hawkins reined his horse to a stop in the center of town, his gang forming a loose semicircle behind him. He cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and lean, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth and the cold calculation in his dark eyes. His black duster coat was immaculate despite the dusty ride, and a silver-plated revolver hung low on his hip. "Well, well." Hawkins's voice carried easily in the morning stillness, a hint of amusement coloring his words. "Looks like we found ourselves in another friendly little town." His gaze swept the street, taking in the modest buildings and nervous faces. "I do hope you'll all be more accommodating than our last hosts. Things got a mite messy in Copper Canyon." Ezra the Snake Thorne, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, dismounted with fluid grace. The man's right hand never strayed far from his holster, and his eyes held the predatory gleam of someone who enjoyed causing pain. The way the other bandits deferred to him marked him clearly as Hawkins's lieutenant. "Name's Thorne," he announced with a yellow-toothed grin. "Boss and I thought we'd come introduce ourselves proper-like, seeing as we might be spending some time in your fine establishment." He approached the nearest store, Peterson's Hardware, and tested the door. Finding it locked, he simply drove his boot through the front window. The sound of shattering glass seemed to break a spell. Several townspeople gasped or cried out, and Sheriff Burke finally emerged from his office, his badge glinting weakly in the morning sun. But he moved like a man underwater, slow and hesitant. "Now see here," the sheriff's voice cracked slightly. "This is a peaceful town and we don't—" "Shut up." Hawkins didn't raise his voice, but the command cracked like a whip. "The adults are talking." He turned to address the gathering crowd. "Here's how this works, friends. Every business in this charming little town is now under the protection of the Iron Riders. That protection costs money. Pay up, Everyone stays healthy. Refuse. He gestured at the broken window. Well, accidents do happen. Thorne had already moved on to the next door, kicking over a barrel of apples that rolled sadly down the dusty street. Other gang members dismounted and spread out, their boots clicking ominously on the wooden sidewalks as they began their systematic shakedown of the town's businesses. 2 bandits entered Clara's store, and Ruby's hands clenched into fists as she heard the shopkeepers' frightened protests through the window. She could see them roughly shoving merchandise off shelves, their laughter mixing with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Across the street, old Silas McCready stood in the doorway of his gunsmith shop, his white hair catching the morning sun. Unlike the other merchants who were hurriedly digging out whatever money they could find, Silas stood straight-backed and defiant. "I'll not pay a penny to thugs and murderers." His voice might have been frail, but it carried clearly. "My father built this shop, and his father before him helped found this town. We didn't bow to outlaws then, and I won't bow to them now." A hush fell over the street. Even the bandits paused in their ransacking to watch as Thorne slowly turned toward the gunsmith shop. His spurs clinked with each deliberate step as he approached Silas. "What did you say, old man?" Silas lifted his chin. "You heard me, you cur. I said—" The sound of Thorne's backhand striking Silas echoed off the buildings. The old man stumbled backward, losing his balance and falling hard onto the wooden sidewalk. A thin line of blood trickled from his split lip. Before she could think better of it, Ruby was moving. She crossed the street in long strides, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Reaching Silas, she knelt beside him, one arm supporting his shoulders as she helped him sit up. "Are you all right, Mr. McCready?" she asked softly, though her eyes never left Thorne. "Careful, girl," Silas whispered. "Don't throw your life away on my account." Ruby helped him to his feet, positioning herself between the old man and Thorne. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the chill of a mountain stream in winter. "Back off." A moment of stunned silence followed her words, broken by Thorne's harsh laugh. "Well, look what we have here, boys. A regular guardian angel?" His hand dropped casually to rest on his gun belt. "Though from the smell of her, I'd say she's just a farm girl who doesn't know her place." The other bandits joined in the laughter, their cruel mirth echoing off the buildings. Someone called out, "Better get back to your chickens, little girl." Another voice added, "Yeah, before you get yourself hurt." The little farm girl's got quite a mouth on her. Thorne sneered, taking a step closer. Maybe someone ought to teach her some manners. Hawkins, who had been watching the scene unfold with evident amusement, now guided his horse forward, the crowd parting before him like water. Now, Thorne. That's no way to treat a lady." His voice dripped with false courtesy. "Especially one brave enough to stand up to the big bad iron riders." He swung down from his saddle with casual grace, his spurs jingling as he approached Ruby. Though he stood nearly a head taller than her, she didn't back away. Her eyes met his steadily, and for a moment, something flickered in Hawkins's expression. A brief uncertainty quickly masked. "What's your name? Farm girl?" he asked, his tone conversational. "Ruby Harper." A spark of recognition lit Hawkins's eyes. Harper? Now why does that name sound familiar? He made a show of thinking about it. Ah yes, Jedediah Harper. Good man with a gun, if I recall right. Up until he wasn't. He smiled, showing too many teeth. That was what, 3 years ago? Ruby's face remained impassive, but her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Hawkins noticed and his smile widened. "Let me give you some friendly advice, Miss Harper," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Heroes don't tend to live very long in these parts. Just ask your father." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you would if you could." The street had gone deathly quiet. Everyone waited for Ruby to back down, to run away, to show some sign of fear. Instead, she held Hawkins's gaze, her green eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him blink first. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hawkins?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. Hawkins's smile faltered for just a moment. Something in her steady gaze unsettled him, though he couldn't say exactly what it was, like looking into the eyes of a wolf while expecting to find a rabbit. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Threatening you? Why, I'm trying to help you, girl. Teaching moments like these don't come along every day." He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. Courage is admirable, but it's also foolish, and foolish people tend to meet unfortunate ends." The townspeople watched in tense silence, their fear a palpable thing. Mothers clutched their children close. Men stared at their boots, unable to meet Ruby's eyes. Only Silas remained straight-backed behind her, his bloody lip beginning to swell. Hawkins turned back to Ruby, his voice dropping again. "Run home now, farm girl. Go tend your chickens and count yourself lucky. I'm in a generous mood today." He reached out, as if to pat her cheek condescendingly. Ruby didn't flinch or move away. Instead, she smiled, a small, cold expression that stopped Hawkins's hand mid-motion. For just a moment, their eyes locked again, and this time, Hawkins took an unconscious step backward. "Everything all right, boss?" Thorne called out, his hand still hovering near his gun. Hawkins covered his momentary unease with a broad laugh. "Just fine, Thorne. Our little farm girl here was just leaving." He turned away dismissively, calling out to his men. "All right, boys, I think we've made our point for today. Let's ride." The Iron Riders remounted with practiced efficiency, their saddlebags heavier with the spoils of their morning's work. As they turned their horses toward the edge of town, Hawkins reined in beside Thorne. "Keep an eye on that one," he muttered, nodding toward Ruby. "There's something not right about her." Thorne spat in the dust. "Want me to take care of it?" "Not yet." Hawkins's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Let's see what she does first." The gang rode out much as they had arrived, in a cloud of dust and menace. Their laughter drifted back on the morning breeze, mixing with the thunder of hooves until both faded into silence. Only then did the tension begin to leak out of the town. People emerged from their hiding places, helping to clean up the mess the bandits had left behind. Sheriff Burke slunk back to his office, avoiding everyone's eyes. Clara began sweeping up broken glass, her hands shaking slightly. Ruby stood in the street a moment longer, watching the dust cloud recede toward the horizon. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the hardest part of being strong is knowing when to wait." "Come on, girl." Silas's weathered voice broke through her thoughts. "Help an old man back to his shop." As she supported his arm, he spoke quietly, meant for her ears alone. "You've got your father's steel in you, that's plain to see. But you've got something else too, don't you? Something you're keeping hidden." Ruby's steps faltered for just a moment. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. McCready." The old gunsmith's laugh turned into a painful cough. "Course you don't. Just like I don't know anything about those perfect groupings I've been finding out on the North Ridge. 3 shots, tight as a fist. Day after day." His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied her face. "Mighty strange, that. Almost as strange as a girl who buys ammunition in exactly the right caliber for a rifle she claims not to know how to use." Inside his shop, Ruby helped Silas into his chair behind the workbench. The old man's domain smelled of gun oil and wood polish, tools arranged with meticulous care on the walls. He dabbed at his split lip with a handkerchief, then fixed Ruby with a steady gaze. "Your father was more than just a customer, you know. He was a friend. Used to talk about you all the time. His little girl with the eagle eye." Silas leaned forward. "Those men? They'll be back. And next time, they won't be in such a generous mood." "I know," Ruby said quietly. "Then you also know that Sheriff Burke won't lift a finger to stop them. Most folks in town will just bow their heads and pray the storm passes quick." He reached under his workbench and pulled out a wooden box, its surface smooth with age. "Your father left this with me, about a week before. Well, before. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe until the right time." Ruby's breath caught as Silas opened the box. Inside, nestled in red velvet, lay a matched pair of Colt revolvers, their blued steel gleaming in the dusty light. Their grips were carved with an intricate pattern of roses, her father's signature work. "He made these himself," Silas explained softly. "Said they were for you when you were ready. I'd say that time's come." Ruby's hand hovered over the weapons, remembering how many hours she'd watched her father work on them in secret, never knowing they were meant for her. "I can't," she whispered. "If Mama knew I was even thinking about standing up to them." "Your mother's afraid of losing you, same as she lost Jed. That's natural." Silas closed the box carefully. "But ask yourself this. What would your father want you to do? These guns, that rifle you practice with every morning, he didn't teach you all that just so you could hide when trouble came." Ruby's mind went to Wesley, to her mother, to all the people in town who couldn't protect themselves. She thought of Copper Canyon, of all the other communities the Iron Riders had broken. And she thought of her father standing his ground that terrible day, refusing to bow to men like Hawkins. "I'll need ammunition," she said finally. "And maybe some advice about quick-draw techniques." Silas' weathered face creased in a smile. "Now that's the Harper spirit. Come by tomorrow at dawn. We've got work to do." As Ruby left the shop, the sun was high overhead, casting short shadows across the town's wounded street. The Iron Riders had shown their hand, revealed their numbers and their tactics. They thought they had found another easy target, another town too frightened to fight back. They were wrong. The night after the Iron Riders' visit seemed darker than usual, as if the stars themselves were hiding. Ruby sat at the kitchen table, methodically cleaning her father's rifle by lamplight. Each movement was practiced, precise, the same routine Jedediah Harper had taught her years ago. The familiar smell of gun oil brought back memories of early morning lessons, his patient voice explaining the importance of maintaining your weapons. "You're up late," Eleanor's voice startled her. Ruby's mother stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the night's chill, her eyes fixed on the rifle, and something like fear crossed her face. "I heard about what happened in town today." "Mama," Ruby began, but Eleanor cut her off. "Claire Winters told me everything about how you stood up to them, how you faced down Clayton Hawkins himself." She moved to the table, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the rifle stock. "You're so much like him, Ruby. Sometimes it terrifies me." "Someone had to do something," Ruby said softly. "You saw what they did to the town. What they'll keep doing unless what? Unless you get yourself killed like your father?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "I've already buried one person I love because they thought they could stand up to men like that. I won't bury another." Ruby set down the cleaning cloth, choosing her words carefully. "Pa used to say that sometimes doing nothing is more dangerous than taking a stand. These men, they don't just want our money or our goods. They want to break us, make us so afraid we forget how to fight back." "Your father said a lot of things," Eleanor's tone was bitter. "He also promised he'd always be here for us. Promises don't stop bullets, Ruby." Before Ruby could respond, Wesley's voice called from upstairs. "Rose." "Mama? There's riders coming." Both women rushed to the window. In the moonlight, they could make out 3 mounted figures approaching the farm at a leisurely pace. Ruby's hand went instinctively to the rifle, but Eleanor grabbed her arm. "No, we'll hide in the cellar. They'll take what they want and leave. Like they left Copper Canyon." Ruby gently but firmly removed her mother's hand. "Get Wesley and hide if you want, but I won't let them destroy what Pa built. Not again." She moved to the front door, rifle in hand, but positioned herself in the shadows where she wouldn't be immediately visible. The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses' hooves muffled in the soft dirt of the yard. "Come on out, farm girl." Thorne's voice carried clearly in the night air. "Boss sent us to finish our conversation this morning." Ruby's finger curled around the rifle's trigger, but she forced herself to wait. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. Patience beats speed every time, Ruby rose. "Let them show their hand first." "Maybe she ain't home," one of the other riders suggested. "We could just burn them out. Ain't that what we usually do?" "Nah," Thorne's laugh was ugly. The boss wants this done proper. Wants to make an example. He raised his voice again. Tell you what, girl. Come on out now. We'll make it quick. Hide, and we burn everything. House, barn, livestock. Your choice. Ruby's mind raced. 3 riders meant 6 guns, assuming they each carried a backup piece. The moonlight would work against them, coming from behind and silhouetting them perfectly against the sky. But one wrong move would put her family at risk. The decision was taken from her when a flaming bottle arced through the air, smashing against the side of the barn. The dry wood caught quickly, orange flames beginning to lick upward. "Oops," Thorne called out. "Looks like time's up." The crack of Ruby's rifle split the night. The bottle in Thorne's hand, his second attempt at arson, exploded, spraying him with burning liquid. He screamed, falling from his horse as he tried to beat out the flames on his coat. "Sniper!" one of the other riders yelled, drawing his gun. "Up by the—" Ruby's second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The third rider was already spurring his horse around, firing wildly into the darkness. His shots went wide, not even coming close to Ruby's position. "Who's out there?" he shouted, fear making his voice crack. "Someone who's tired of bullies," Ruby answered, her voice carrying clearly from the shadows. "Take your friends and go. Tell Hawkins this farm's off limits." "You're dead!" Thorne had managed to extinguish his burning coat. "You hear me? Dead! The boss will—" Another shot kicked up dirt inches from his feet. "Next one won't miss," Ruby promised. "Your choice." They chose to leave, helping their wounded companion onto his horse, and riding, hard, into the night. Only when their hoofbeats had faded completely did Ruby emerge from her position. The barn fire wasn't serious. She'd caught it early enough that a few buckets of water took care of it. She found her mother and Wesley in the cellar holding each other tightly. "It's safe now," she told them. "They're gone." Wesley's eyes were wide with excitement. "That was amazing. How did you—" "Not now," Eleanor cut him off. She looked at Ruby, really looked at her as if seeing her daughter for the first time. "How long?" "How long have you been practicing with his rifle?" "Since before he died," Ruby admitted. "Pa said I had a natural talent for it. Said someday I might need to protect what's ours." She knelt beside her mother. "I'm sorry I kept it from you, but I'm not sorry for what I did tonight." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father used to say that true strength isn't in knowing how to fight. It's in knowing what you're fighting for." She reached out, touching Ruby's cheek gently. "Promise me one thing. Promise me you'll be smarter about it than he was. Promise me you'll get help." "I will," Ruby said. "Starting tomorrow. Old Silas McCready's agreed to help me train. And I think Deputy Tucker might be willing to learn a few things too." "They'll be back," Wesley said quietly. "Won't they?" Ruby nodded, watching the sun begin to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "Yes, they'll be back. And this time we'll be ready for them." The morning breeze carried the scent of smoke and sage mixing with the familiar smells of the farm. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, a lonely sound that seemed to echo Ruby's own determination. The Iron Riders had no idea what they'd awakened, but they would learn soon enough. Dawn was breaking over Willow Creek, and with it, everything was about to change. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern hills when Ruby slipped into Silas McCready's shop the next morning. The old gunsmith was already awake, his workbench cleared except for the wooden box containing the matched Colts and several boxes of ammunition. "Right on time," he said, his split lip from yesterday's encounter with Thorne still swollen, but his eyes bright. "Heard about your visitors last night. 3 shots in the dark, 2 hits and 1 warning. Your father would have been proud." "Word travels fast," Ruby observed, carefully lifting one of the Colts from its velvet nest. The weight felt different from her rifle, more immediate, more personal. "In a town like this, might as well have rung the church bell." Silas adjusted his spectacles. Thorne and his boys rode through about an hour ago, heading for the Iron Riders' camp. They looked like they'd seen a ghost, or something that scared them worse. They'll be back with more men next time. Count on it. That's why we're not just working on your shooting today. Silas moved to a locked cabinet behind his workbench. Your father wasn't just good with a gun. He was smart about how he used it. Strategy, positioning, reading people. Those are the skills that keep you alive. The old gunsmith spread a crude map of the territory across his workbench. The Iron Riders aren't just a gang. They're an organization. They have supply lines, informants, safe houses. Beat them, you need to understand how they think, how they move. For the next hour, Silas walked Ruby through everything he knew about the Iron Riders' operations. Their main camp was in an abandoned silver mine about 15 miles outside of town, but they had smaller outposts scattered throughout the territory. They moved in predictable patterns, always following the same basic strategy. Isolate, intimidate, then break any resistance. They're creatures of habit, Silas explained, marking positions on the map. That's their weakness. They do things the same way because it's always worked before. Makes them predictable if you know what to look for. A knock at the back door interrupted their planning. Deputy Caleb Tucker stood there, looking nervous but determined. Miss Harper, Mr. McCready. I heard some talk about what happened at your farm last night, about someone standing up to Thorne and his boys. Ruby exchanged glances with Silas. The old gunsmith nodded slightly. Come in, Deputy, Ruby said. How'd you like to learn the right way to draw that gun of yours? Tucker's face lit up. Yes, ma'am. I mean, if you're willing to teach me. The sheriff, he means well, but he's more interested in keeping his head down than keeping the peace, Silas finished. Well, come on then. Let's see what you know. They moved to the practice area behind the shop, where Silas had set up targets at various distances. The morning passed quickly as Ruby shared the techniques her father had taught her. Proper stance, breathing control, the importance of smooth movement over raw speed. You're rushing it, she told Tucker, adjusting his grip. Speed comes from efficiency, not hurry. Every motion should flow into the next like water running downhill. The deputy was a quick study, his earlier clumsiness giving way to more controlled movements as he absorbed their lessons. By midday, he was hitting his targets consistently, his confidence growing with each successful shot. There's more to learn, Silas told him. But you've got the makings of a real lawman, son, assuming you're willing to be one? I am, Tucker said firmly. After seeing what they did to the town yesterday, how they treated folks. It ain't right. Sheriff might be willing to look the other way, but I can't. Their session was interrupted by the arrival of Clara Winters, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Thought you all might be hungry, she said, setting out sandwiches and coffee. But her real purpose became clear as she added, and I thought you should know. Hawkins sent riders to all the surrounding farms this morning. They're demanding protection money by sunset tomorrow. Ruby's hands clenched. How much? More than most can afford to pay, those that can't. Clara's voice trailed off. We'll lose everything, Silas finished grimly. Just like in Copper Canyon. Not this time, Ruby said quietly. She turned to Tucker. Deputy, how many in town do you trust? Really trust? Tucker thought for a moment. Maybe half a dozen. The Peterson boys from the hardware store, they're solid. Young Will Matthews from the livery stable, a few others. Get them together. Quietly. Bring them here after sunset. She looked at Clara. We'll need information. Who's being threatened? Who might be willing to help? Who might be working with the Iron Riders? The shopkeeper nodded. Leave that to me. Nobody pays much attention to what women talk about while they're buying supplies. What are you planning? Silas asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. Pa used to say that bullies are only strong when people are afraid. Well, it's time to teach them what happens when people stop being afraid. Ruby checked her father's Colts, making sure the actions were smooth. But first, I need to make a few more house calls. She spent the afternoon riding from farm to farm, carefully avoiding the Iron Riders' patrols. At each stop, she found the same story: hard-working people being squeezed by Hawkins's demands, afraid but angry. Some, like old Pete Wilson, had already decided to fight. "They can burn my barn," the grizzled farmer declared, "but I'll be damned if I just hand over what's mine." Others needed more convincing, but Ruby's demonstration of her shooting skills and the story of how she had driven off Thorne's night raiders helped change minds. By the time the sun was setting, she had a network of allies stretching across the valley. Back at Silas's shop, she found more than a dozen townspeople gathered in the back room. Deputy Tucker had chosen well. These weren't hotheads looking for excitement, but serious men and women who had simply had enough. "It won't be easy," Ruby told them. "The Iron Riders are organized, well-armed and used to getting their way. But they've never faced a town that was ready for them. Never faced people who knew how to fight back." She laid out her plan, a strategy of coordinated resistance that would use the Iron Riders' own predictability against them. Some would learn to shoot, others would serve as lookouts or help gather intelligence. Everyone had a part to play. As the meeting broke up, Silas pulled Ruby aside. "You've started something here, girl, something that could change everything. Or get a lot of people killed." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why we have to get it right." The old gunsmith squeezed her shoulder. "Your father would be proud. Now let's make sure you live long enough to finish what you've started." Outside, the stars were coming out, bright points of hope in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, the Iron Riders would learn that Willow Creek wasn't like other towns. Tomorrow, the real fight will begin. Dawn painted the hills in shades of gold and shadow as Ruby checked her position, one final time. The outcropping gave her a perfect view of the valley road where the Iron Riders' collection party would be passing. According to Clara's intelligence, they always followed the same route, hitting the outlying farms in a clockwise pattern, before returning to their camp with their ill-gotten gains. "Predictable," Silas had said. "That'll be their undoing." Through her father's old spyglass, Ruby could see Deputy Tucker and the Peterson brothers hidden among the rocks on the opposite side of the narrow pass. Further down, Will Matthews waited with fresh horses, ready for the next phase of their plan. Everything was in position. Now they just had to wait. The sun had climbed halfway to its zenith when the first sounds of approaching riders reached them. Ruby recognized Thorne's voice, carrying clearly in the morning air. "After we finish the collections, Boss wants us to pay another visit to that Harper farm. Show them what happens when you cross the Iron Riders." "Thought you said it was just one girl," another rider responded. "Why do we need 8 men for one girl?" "You weren't there the other night," Thorne snapped. "Something ain't natural about how she shoots, like she's got eyes in the dark or something." Ruby allowed herself a small smile as she sighted down her rifle. Let them think it was supernatural. Fear was a weapon too, just as her father had taught her. The riders came into view, 8 men spread out in a loose formation. Their saddlebags were already heavy with collections from the northern farms. She waited until they were perfectly positioned in the narrowest part of the pass, then squeezed the trigger. Her shot struck the ground directly in front of the lead horse, causing it to rear in panic. The rider went down hard, and chaos erupted as the other horses startled. "Ambush!" Thorne shouted, drawing his gun. "Up in the rocks!" Tucker and the Peterson brothers opened fire from their position, forcing the riders to dive for cover behind boulders. The Iron Riders' return fire was wild, uncoordinated. They weren't used to facing organized resistance. "Drop your weapons," Ruby's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "This is your only warning." "It's the Harper girl." One of the riders tried to draw a bead on her position, but Ruby's second shot knocked his gun from his hand. "Last chance," she called out. "Surrender now. You ride out of here alive. Keep fighting. You don't ride out at all." Thorne's response was a string of curses and another wild shot in her direction. "You're dead, girl, you hear me? When the boss hears about this, The boss is going to be mighty disappointed, Ruby cut him off, putting a bullet through his hat. Along with all the folks you've been stealing from. The firefight lasted another few minutes, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Ruby's group had the high ground, better positions, and the element of surprise. When the dust settled, 2 of the Iron Riders were wounded. Nothing serious, but enough to take the fight out of them. The others had either surrendered or fled, leaving their horses and stolen goods behind. "Tie them up," Ruby ordered, making her way down to the road. "Will, get those fresh horses ready, we've got some collections to return." Tucker and the others quickly secured the prisoners, using their own gun belts to bind their hands. Thorne glared at Ruby as she approached, hatred burning in his eyes. "You've signed your own death warrant," he spat. "Hawkins will burn your whole town for this." "Maybe," Ruby acknowledged, checking the ropes holding him. "Or maybe we're just getting started. Your choice if you want to be around to find out." They sent the captured riders walking back toward the Iron Riders' camp, minus their weapons, horses, and stolen goods. The message was clear. Willow Creek wasn't going to be an easy target anymore. As they began redistributing the stolen money and valuables to their rightful owners, Ruby noticed Tucker staring at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Something on your mind, Deputy?" "Just wondering," he said, securing a strongbox to his saddle. "Where'd you learn to plan something like this? The positioning, the timing. It's like you've been doing it all your life." Ruby thought about all those early morning lessons with her father, how he'd taught her more than just shooting. He'd taught her to think, to plan, to understand the psychology of conflict. "My father," she said finally. "He always said that winning a fight starts long before the first shot. It's about knowing your ground, knowing your opponent, and most importantly, knowing yourself." "Smart man," Tucker nodded. "Wish I'd known him." "Me too," Ruby said softly. Then she straightened in her saddle. "Come on, we've got deliveries to make." They spent the rest of the morning returning the stolen goods to the outlying farms. At each stop, they found people surprised and grateful, not just for the return of their property, but for the hope it represented. Word spread quickly through the valley. Someone had finally stood up to the Iron Riders and won. By the time they returned to town, the story had grown in the telling. Ruby overheard snippets of conversation as they rode down the main street, took on 8 of them single-handed, shot the guns right out of their hands. Just like her father. She knew the exaggerated stories would reach Hawkins quickly. That was part of the plan. Let him wonder, let him worry. Let him start to feel what it was like to be afraid. At Silas's shop, they found Clara waiting with fresh coffee and news from town. "Sheriff Burke's beside himself," she reported with barely concealed satisfaction. "Says you're going to bring hell down on all of us. But I noticed he didn't try to stop you." "What about the others?" Ruby asked. "The townspeople?" "Mixed reactions. Some are scared, but more are talking about fighting back. Your little victory this morning gave them something they haven't had in a long time. Hope." Silas emerged from his workshop carrying a newly cleaned rifle. "Hope's good," he said, checking the weapon's action. "But Hawkins won't take this lying down. He'll hit back hard, try to make an example of us." "I know," Ruby agreed. "That's why we're just getting started. Tucker, get your trusted men together. Clara, we'll need more eyes and ears. Silas, ... She smiled at the old gunsmith. "We've got more people wanting to learn to shoot." As the others dispersed to their tasks, Ruby stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The town felt different somehow. People walked a little straighter, spoke a little louder. Fear still hung in the air, but it was changing, mixing with something else. Determination. She touched the grips of her father's Colts, thinking about what was coming. The Iron Riders would respond with force probably soon, but for the first time in years, Willow Creek was ready to fight back. And this time, they weren't fighting alone. Clayton Hawkins stood at the entrance of the abandoned silver mine, watching the last rays of sunset paint the canyon walls blood red. The Iron Riders' main camp bustled with activity behind him as his men prepared for what was coming. His cold eyes studied the report in his hands, a detailed account of the morning's ambush along with information about the growing resistance in Willow Creek. "Still think we should have killed the Harper girl when we had the chance," Thorne growled, touching the bandage on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. "Now she's got the whole valley thinking they can fight back." "Patience," Hawkins folded the paper carefully. "Sometimes you have to let a fire spread before you can put it out properly. Let them think they've won. Let them get bold. Then we'll show them what real fear looks like." He turned to address the gathered riders. "Tonight, we remind them why people fear the Iron Riders. No killing. Not yet. But by sunrise, I want everyone in that valley to understand the price of defiance." As his men mounted up, Hawkins added one final instruction. "And find out where that Harper girl's brother likes to practice with his slingshot. It's time she learned what it costs to play hero." The moon was just rising when Ruby heard the first screams. She'd been cleaning her rifles at the kitchen table, unable to sleep after the morning's victory, when the sound of galloping hooves shattered the night's peace. Before she could reach the window, the first buildings on the outskirts of town erupted in flames. "Wesley!" she called up the stairs. "Get Mama to the storm cellar. Now!" The Iron Riders had come in force, at least 20 mounted men carrying torches and splitting into smaller groups to hit multiple targets simultaneously. Through her window, Ruby could see fires starting at the livery stable, the general store, and several homes. A horse's whinny of pain cut through the chaos. They were shooting people's livestock, too. The message was clear: submit or lose everything. Ruby grabbed her weapons and ran for the barn, where she'd stationed one of the Peterson brothers as a lookout. She found him unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. After dragging him to safety, she climbed to the hayloft, positioning herself to cover the main approach to the farm. Through her rifle scope, she could see Deputy Tucker and some townspeople organizing a bucket line, trying to save Clara's store. Others were helping evacuate families from the burning buildings. But the Iron Riders were moving too fast, striking and moving on before anyone could mount an effective response. A familiar laugh made her blood run cold. Thorne was leading a group of riders toward her family's farm, torches held high. "Come on out, little hero," he called. "Time to see what your courage costs." Ruby's rifle cracked, sending Thorne's torch spinning into the dust. Her second shot dropped another rider's hat into the dirt. But there were too many of them, spreading out to surround the farm. "Burn it," Thorne ordered. "Burn it all." Flaming bottles arced through the air, smashing against the barn and house. Ruby shot 2 more riders, but she couldn't stop them all. The dry wood caught quickly, orange flames beginning to climb the walls. "Wesley! Mama!" she shouted, scrambling down from her position. She had to get to them. Had to. A bullet splintered the wood beside her head. Hawkins himself sat his horse at the edge of the property, his silver-plated revolver gleaming in the firelight. "Quite a shot you are, Miss Harper," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the crackling flames. "Just like your father. But he learned the hard way. Being right doesn't make you bulletproof." Ruby dove behind a water trough as more shots kicked up dust around her. She could hear Wesley shouting from somewhere near the house, then her mother's scream of terror. "You want to be a hero?" Hawkins continued. "Fine. Let's see if you can save them all." Through the smoke, Ruby saw other riders spreading out through town. More buildings were burning now, more screams filling the night. They were attacking everyone who'd helped her, everyone who dared to resist. She had a clean shot at Hawkins. One bullet could end it all. But taking it would mean leaving her family, leaving the townspeople who needed help. Just like her father had faced an impossible choice that day 3 years ago. A crash from the barn made her decision. Wesley's voice called out in pain, followed by Thorne's cruel laugh. Ruby fired twice more to keep the riders' heads down, then sprinted toward the sound. She found her brother trapped beneath a fallen beam with Thorne standing over him. The enforcer's face split in a yellow-toothed grin as he raised his gun. Ruby's first shot knocked the weapon from his hand. Her second caught him in the leg as he tried to dive for cover. He went down hard, cursing. "Wesley!" she called out, rushing to her brother, "Hold on, I'll get you out." The beam was heavy, but fear gave her strength. Together with her mother, who appeared through the smoke like a guardian angel, they managed to free Wesley. His leg was badly bruised, but not broken. "Get to the root cellar," Ruby ordered, pressing her father's other Colt into her mother's hands. "Stay there until I come for you." "Ruby, no," Eleanor grabbed her arm. "You can't face them alone." "I'm not alone," Ruby said, and as if to prove her point, shots rang out from the direction of town. She recognized the sharp crack of Silas's rifle, followed by the deeper boom of Tucker's shotgun. The resistance was fighting back. "Go," she told her family. "I'll keep them busy." As Eleanor and Wesley disappeared into the smoke, Ruby turned to face the riders. The night had become a chaos of gunfire, flames, and shouting. But through it all, she could hear Hawkins calling to her, taunting her. "Time to choose, farm girl. Your family or your precious town. That's the price of standing up to us. You can't save everyone." Ruby checked her ammunition, thinking of her father's last stand. He'd faced the same choice, his family or his principles. She touched the grip of his rifle, remembering his words. Sometimes the hardest part of being strong is knowing what you're really fighting for. The night wasn't over, and Ruby Harper had finally figured out what she was fighting for. Not just her family, not just the town, but the right of good people to live without fear. Let Hawkins think he had her trapped. Let him think he'd won. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, she wasn't going to let anyone face it alone. Smoke filled the night air as Ruby raced through the burning town, moving from shadow to shadow. Her father's training guided every step. Stay low, use cover, keep moving. The Iron Riders had spread themselves thin, trying to hit multiple targets at once. That was their mistake, and she intended to make them pay for it. A shot rang out from the church steeple, followed by a rider's cry of pain. Old Silas was making good use of his position. Another blast from somewhere near the general store told her Deputy Tucker was still in the fight. But they needed more. They needed everyone. Ruby reached the sheriff's office to find Burke cowering behind his desk. "Either help or get out of the way," she told him, grabbing boxes of ammunition from the storage cabinet. "You don't understand," Burke stammered. "Hawkins will kill everyone who stands against him." "He'll kill us anyway," Ruby countered, checking the loading gate on her revolver. "At least this way we die on our feet." She turned to leave, then stopped. "You know what my father's last words were, Sheriff? Some things are worth dying for." He was right. She left Burke to his cowardice and moved on. The town hall's bell began to ring. Clara's signaled that she'd gathered the townspeople in the basement as planned. It was time to put the next phase of their strategy into action. "Will!" she called out as she passed the livery stable. The young stable hand appeared from the shadows, leading several saddled horses. "Get them to the meeting point and we'll make it count." The boy nodded grimly and disappeared into the smoke with the horses. Ruby continued on, making her way to where Tucker was coordinating the defense near Clara's store. "They're trying to burn us out," the deputy reported, reloading his shotgun. "But they're getting sloppy, spreading themselves too thin." "That's what we wanted," Ruby said. "How many do you count?" 20, maybe 25. More than this morning. But not all of them, Ruby smiled coldly. "Hawkins is keeping some in reserve, watching to see what we do. That means we've got him worried." A crash from further down the street drew their attention. The Iron Riders had set fire to the bank, but something was wrong. Instead of spreading, the flames seemed to sputter and die. "Wet hay," Tucker grinned. "Just like you said. We soaked every building we could after this morning's fight." Ruby nodded. "Another part of the plan is working. The Iron Riders would waste time and effort trying to burn structures that wouldn't catch easily, keeping them occupied while the real counterattack came together." "Peterson boys in position?" she asked. "Ready and waiting. Silas is keeping the riders pushed to the east side of town, just like you wanted." More gunfire erupted from the direction of the church, followed by shouts of confusion from the Iron Riders. They were starting to realize that their targets were fighting back in coordinated ways, not just running in panic. "Miss Harper," young Tommy Wilson came running up, his face streaked with soot. "Ma says to tell you the families are all safe in the town hall basement, and Mr. McCready wants you to know the package is ready." Ruby checked her father's pocket watch in the flickering firelight. Almost time. "Tell Silas to start falling back. Make it look good." As Tommy disappeared into the smoke, she turned to Tucker. "Ready to show these boys what a real lawman looks like?" The deputy chambered around in his shotgun. "Born ready." They moved through the town together, gathering defenders as they went. The Iron Riders had started to bunch up, uncertain now that their terror tactics weren't working as planned. Ruby could hear Thorne shouting orders, trying to maintain control of the increasingly chaotic situation. "Find that girl," he bellowed. "Boss wants her alive." "You want me?" Ruby called out, her voice carrying clearly through the smoke. "Come and get me!" She fired twice, dropping 2 more riders from their horses. The others returned fire, but their shots went wild. They were shooting at shadows while she picked her targets carefully, just as her father had taught her. The crack of Silas's rifle drew their attention to the church, where the old gunsmith appeared to be retreating. Several riders spurred their horses forward, eager to catch him. "That's it," Ruby whispered. "Just a little further." The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. Will Matthews and the other stable hands had moved the loaded hay wagon into position earlier, timing it perfectly. As the riders passed beneath the church's arch, the wagon tipped, sending its cargo of barrels cascading down. The barrels burst on impact, spraying their contents everywhere. Not water, as the riders probably expected, but coal oil. The same coal oil they'd tried to use to burn the town. "Now!" Ruby's command was punctuated by the sound of multiple rifles being cocked. Lanterns flew from hidden positions, igniting the oil. Flames roared up in a perfect circle, trapping the riders in a ring of their own making. Horses reared in panic, throwing their riders. Guns clattered to the ground as men desperately tried to escape the inferno. "Drop your weapons!" Tucker's voice boomed with newfound authority. "You're surrounded!" And they were. Townspeople emerged from their positions, rifles and shotguns trained on the trapped riders. Clara Winters stood in the doorway of her store, a double-barrel shotgun held with comfortable familiarity. The Peterson brothers had their rifles ready. Even old Pete Wilson had joined the fight, his ancient Sharps rifle rock-steady in his gnarled hands. "This is what happens," Ruby called out to the dismounted riders, "when people stop being afraid and start standing together." But even as the defenders began securing their prisoners, she knew it wasn't over. Hawkins was still out there, probably watching from a safe distance. He'd lost men tonight, lost face, but he hadn't lost his power. If anything, this would make him more dangerous. The night sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first hint of dawn painting the smoke clouds in shades of pink and gold. Ruby looked at the gathered townspeople, tired, soot-stained, but standing tall. They'd won this fight, but the war was far from over. And somewhere out there, Clayton Hawkins was already planning his revenge. Dawn revealed the full extent of the night's battle. Though many buildings had been saved by Ruby's preparation with the wet hay, others hadn't been so fortunate. The livery stable was a smoking ruin, and several homes on the outskirts of town had burned to the ground. But it was the Iron Riders who had suffered the worst losses. 8 captured, 3 wounded, and their fearsome reputation badly damaged. Ruby stood in front of the jail, watching Deputy Tucker process the last of the prisoners. The captured riders looked smaller somehow in the morning light, their swagger replaced by sullen silence. All except Thorne, who hadn't stopped smiling since they'd locked him up. "You think you've won something?" he called through the bars. "You have no idea what's coming. Boss is gonna make what happened to Copper Canyon look like a Sunday picnic." "Let him try," Tucker responded, checking the cell doors one final time. But Ruby noticed his hands shaking slightly as he turned the keys. She left the deputy to his duties and made her way to Silas's shop, where the town council had gathered for an emergency meeting. The old gunsmith's workspace had become their de facto headquarters, maps and plans spread across his workbench. "We should strike now," Pete Wilson was saying as she entered. "Hit their main camp while they're reeling. End this once and for all." "With what army?" Clara countered. "We barely held them off last night, and that was with every advantage of surprise and preparation. Besides," Silas added, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, "Hawkins wasn't even here last night. That was just a raiding party." "He's right," Ruby confirmed, joining them at the workbench. "Hawkins is too smart to risk himself like that. He was watching, learning our capabilities. Now he knows what we can do." "And what we can't," Silas finished grimly. The meeting was interrupted by young Tommy Wilson bursting in with panic in his eyes. "Riders coming," he gasped. "Lots of them, from the east." Ruby ran outside, rifle ready, but what she saw made her blood run cold. At least 40 riders approached in perfect formation, with Clayton Hawkins at their head. This wasn't a raiding party, this was an army. "Get everyone inside," she ordered. "Bolt the doors, stay away from windows." But even as she gave the commands, she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. Hawkins reined his horse to a stop in the center of town, his men forming an iron ring around the main street. His voice carried easily in the morning stillness. "I have to admit, Miss Harper, you've impressed me. Not many could turn a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers into a fighting force overnight." His smile was cold. "But now it's time for your lesson in consequences." He raised his hand, and his men brought forward something that made Ruby's heart stop. Wesley, bound and gagged, his face bruised but his eyes defiant. "Let him go." Ruby's rifle came up, but Hawkins already had a gun to her brother's head. "Drop the rifle," he said calmly, "unless you want to see if you're fast enough to save him." The weapon felt like lead in her hands as she slowly lowered it to the ground. Around the town, she could hear other guns being dropped as defenders realized the hopelessness of their position. "Much better," Hawkins nodded. "Now, here's how this is going to work. You and your little resistance are done. Anyone who fought against us last night has until sunset to leave town, permanently. Those who stay will pay triple our usual protection rates. And if we refuse?" Clara's voice rang out from her store's doorway. Hawkins's smile widened. "Then we burn everything. Not just buildings this time, crops, livestock, everything. And we start with the boy." Ruby met her brother's eyes, seeing the same stubborn courage that had marked their father's last moments. Wesley shook his head slightly, telling her not to give in, but she couldn't watch another family member die. "I'll make you a deal," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Let Wesley go, let everyone else stay. I'm the one who started this, I'm the one you want." "Ruby, no!" Silas called out, but Hawkins raised his hand for silence. "Go on. A shooting contest. You and me. If I win, you leave Willow Creek for good. If you win..." She took a deep breath. "If you win, you can do whatever you want with me, but you leave everyone else alone." Hawkins studied her for a long moment, genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Interesting proposal. But why should I agree when I already hold all the cards?" "Because you want to know," Ruby said simply. "You want to know if you could beat Jedediah Harper's daughter in a fair fight. It's been eating at you ever since you found out who I am." A murmur ran through the Iron Riders' ranks. Even Hawkins's cold mask slipped for just a moment, showing something like hunger in his eyes. "Terms?" he asked finally. 6 shots each. Moving targets. Winner takes all." Hawkins considered for another long moment, then nodded. "Sunset. At the old creek bed outside town. Bring your own weapons." He turned to his men. "Release the boy." They shoved Wesley roughly toward Ruby, who caught him in a fierce embrace. As she removed his gag, he whispered urgently, "Don't do this, Rose." "He won't keep his word." "I know," she whispered back. "But he's given us something more valuable than his word. He's given us time." Hawkins wheeled his horse around, preparing to leave. But he had one final message. "Oh, and Miss Harper, just so we're clear about the stakes, if you're not there at sunset or if you try any tricks, we'll kill every man, woman, and child in this valley, starting with your family." As the Iron Riders rode out, the townspeople gathered around Ruby. She could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else. Hope, mixed with determination. "Do you have a plan?" Tucker asked quietly. Ruby watched the dust cloud of the departing riders, remembering everything her father had taught her about strategy, about patience, about choosing your ground. "Yes," she said finally. "But I'm going to need everyone's help, and we have to work fast." The sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the hours until sunset, until the moment when everything would be decided, one way or another. The hours before sunset were a blur of focused activity. Ruby gathered her core group in Silas's back room, where they could plan without being overheard. The old gunsmith had already spread out maps of the creek bed and surrounding area. "Hawkins will have men hidden here, here, and here." Ruby indicated several positions. "He's not planning on a fair fight." "Then why agree to it at all?" Wesley asked, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had cut into them. "Why not just kill us all this morning when he had the chance?" "Pride," Silas answered, before Ruby could. "And something else, something personal." He looked at Ruby knowingly. "It's about your father, isn't it?" Ruby nodded, remembering the look in Hawkins's eyes when she'd mentioned Jedediah Harper. "Pa wounded him once years ago, left him with a limp he tries to hide. That's why he really killed him. Not for the horses, not for the defiance, for making him feel weak. And now he wants to prove himself by beating you," Tucker concluded. "But that still doesn't explain why he's giving us time to prepare." "Because he thinks he knows what we'll try," Ruby smiled grimly. "He expects us to set up an ambush just like we did with his raiders. He'll have the whole area surrounded hours before sunset." "So what's the real plan?" Clara asked. "Because I know that look in your eye, Ruby Harper. You're not really planning to face him alone." Instead of answering directly, Ruby turned to Will Matthews. "How are you with that new telegraph key we installed last month?" The young stable hand straightened proudly. "Getting better every day. Can send about 20 words a minute now." "Good, because we need to send a lot of messages, and we need to send them fast." She pointed to several locations on the map. "Tucker, I need you and the Peterson boys to make a lot of noise heading toward these positions. Make it obvious, like you're trying to be subtle but failing." "A diversion?" The deputy nodded. "Draw his men away from where we really want to hit." "Exactly. Clara, I need you to spread some very specific rumors. Make sure they get to the Iron Rider's spy in town." "Old Jim at the saloon," Clara nodded. "He's been feeding them information for months. What do you want him to hear?" Ruby detailed her plans, watching understanding dawn in their faces. When she finished, Silas was grinning broadly. "Just like your father," he said. "He always said the best shot is the one you don't have to take." "But what if it doesn't work?" Wesley asked quietly. "What if we can't get word out in time?" "Then I face him alone," Ruby said simply. "And I make it count." They split up to handle their assigned tasks. As the others left, Silas held Ruby back. "There's something else you need to know," the old gunsmith said. "Something your father told me before he died." He moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop. "He said if anything happened to him, I should keep this safe until you were ready." From the cabinet, he withdrew a wooden box she'd never seen before. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a rifle unlike any she'd ever seen. "Your father's masterpiece," Silas explained. "He worked on it in secret for years. Custom sights, matched ammunition, perfect balance. Said it was for the day when you'd need something special." Ruby lifted the weapon reverently. The stock was inscribed with a simple message. "For Ruby Rose, stand true." "He knew," she whispered. "Somehow he knew this day would come." "Your father was many things," Silas said softly. But above all, he was a man who prepared for the future. He knew the territory was changing, knew someday someone would have to stand up to men like Hawkins. He made sure you'd be ready when that day came. For the next few hours, Ruby practiced with the new rifle, getting a feel for its unique characteristics. It was lighter than her usual weapon, but perfectly balanced. The sight seemed to naturally align with her eye, making even difficult shots feel almost easy. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with activity that looked like panic but was actually carefully orchestrated preparation. People loaded wagons with valuables, making a show of preparing to leave. Others boarded up windows and doors, as if expecting another attack. Tucker and his men rode out in several directions, making enough noise to draw attention, but not so much as to be obviously fake. Clara's rumors spread through town, each one designed to paint a specific picture for Hawkins's spies. By mid-afternoon, Ruby had confirmation that everything was in place. Will's telegraph had been busy, sending messages to every town within 50 miles. Clara's rumors were already making their way back to them through different channels, expanded and distorted in ways that would make them more believable. "It's time," she told her mother as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Eleanor Harper hadn't said much since the morning's confrontation, but now she pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "But please, Ruby, come back to us." "I will, Mama. I promise." She changed into fresh clothes, not her usual work dress, but a practical outfit more suited for what was to come. Her father's matched Colts rode on her hips and his special rifle was slung across her back. As she prepared to ride out, Wesley caught her arm. "I'm coming with you." "No," she said firmly. "I need you here. You know what to do if She couldn't finish the sentence. "If things go wrong," he completed. "I know, but they won't. You're the best shot in 3 territories. Second best," she corrected with a small smile. "Pa was better. Pa never had to face down the whole Iron Riders gang." Ruby mounted up, taking one last look at the town she'd come to love. The sun was a giant red ball touching the western hills, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. "Remember," she told the gathered townspeople, "whatever happens at sunset, stick to the plan. It's bigger than just me now." As she rode toward the creek bed, she thought about everything that had led to this moment. All the dawn practices with her father, all the secret sessions with his rifle, all the lessons about patience and strategy and choosing your ground. One way or another, it would all be decided soon. And Clayton Hawkins was about to learn the last lesson Jedediah Harper had to teach, through his daughter's hands. The old creek bed stretched out before Ruby like a natural amphitheater, its worn banks carved by years of spring floods. Now in the dying light of day, it seemed designed for what was about to unfold. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, turning the world into sharp contrasts of light and dark. Clayton Hawkins was already there, standing beside his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he held all the cards. His silver-plated revolver gleamed at his hip, and his black duster coat moved slightly in the evening breeze. "I was starting to wonder if you'd lost your nerve," he called out as Ruby approached. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you came. Harpers never did know when to back down." Ruby dismounted smoothly, her father's special rifle slung across her back. She'd positioned herself carefully, using the angle of the sun to her advantage, just as Jedediah had taught her. "Let's get this over with." "Not yet." Hawkins's smile was cold. "First, I want you to look around. Really look. See all my men in position? They're not just here to make sure you don't try anything foolish. They're here to witness what happens when someone challenges the Iron Riders." Ruby made a show of scanning the ridgeline, pretending to be surprised by the number of armed men visible there. In truth, she'd already counted them, 38 that she could see, probably another dozen hidden in the rocks. "Quite an audience for a simple shooting contest," she observed. "Nothing simple about it, girl. This is about making an example. After tonight, no one in 3 territories will dare stand against us again." He paused, studying her face. Unless, of course, you'd like to reconsider. Bend the knee now. I might even let you keep that fancy rifle of yours. Like you let my father keep his life after he surrendered." The words were out before Ruby could stop them, bitter as creek water in her mouth. Something flickered in Hawkins's eyes, not guilt, but something close to satisfaction. "So, you know about that? Good. Then you know how this really ends." He gestured to one of his men, who began setting up the targets, bottles on posts at varying distances. 6 shots each, Hawkins continued. Alternating. Hit all your targets, you live. Miss even 1 dot. He let the implication hang in the air. Ruby touched the grip of her father's rifle, drawing strength from the familiar wood. The inscription caught the last rays of sunlight. Stand true. "Ladies first," Hawkins offered with mock courtesy. Ruby lifted the rifle smoothly, sighting down its length at the first target. The special sights her father had designed seemed to gather the fading light, making the bottle stand out clearly against the darkening sky. Her breath slowed, just as she'd been taught. The shot cracked across the creek bed and the first bottle exploded into glittering shards. Hawkins nodded appreciatively, then drew his revolver in one fluid motion. His shot was just as clean, just as precise. The second bottle disappeared in a spray of glass. They continued trading shots, each one perfect, each target destroyed. Ruby could feel the tension building among the watching riders. This wasn't the easy victory their boss had promised. As she lined up her final shot, Hawkins spoke again. "You know what your father's last words were?" When Ruby didn't respond, he continued. He said, "My daughter will make you pay." Imagine that. Even dying, he believed in you. Ruby's finger tightened on the trigger, but she forced herself to wait, to breathe. "You're lying," she said quietly. "Pa never begged, never threatened. He died standing true, just like he lived." Her last shot struck home, the bottle shattering into diamond dust in the sunset light. Hawkins raised his revolver for his final shot, but paused. "You're good, girl. Maybe even as good as your father. But you made the same mistake he did, thinking that being right makes you bulletproof." That's when Ruby smiled and the expression stopped him cold. "No," she said clearly. "I learned from his mistake. He faced you alone. I didn't." As if on cue, rifles appeared along the ridgeline. Not held by iron riders, but by lawmen, lots of them. "You see," Ruby continued, "while you were watching us set up obvious ambush positions, you missed Will Matthews at the telegraph office. Missed him sending messages to every marshal, sheriff, and deputy in 3 territories. Messages about the location of the infamous Iron Riders' main camp, about how their leader would be occupied at sunset." More lawmen emerged from hiding, weapons trained on the suddenly nervous Iron Riders. Ruby recognized Marshal Daniel Blake among them, his badge catching the last light of day. "And while your spy in town was listening to carefully planted rumors about our plans for an ambush, he missed Clara Winters telegraphing detailed information about your organization to every law enforcement office within 100 miles. Names, hideouts, supply caches, everything we've learned over the past few days." Hawkins's face had gone pale, his gun hand trembling slightly. "You were so focused on breaking one small town you missed the bigger picture. We didn't need to beat you in a gunfight. We just needed to keep you distracted long enough for justice to catch up. Take them." Marshal Blake's voice rang out across the creek bed. The lawmen closed in from all sides, having thoroughly surrounded the Iron Riders during Ruby and Hawkins's shooting contest. Hawkins's face contorted with rage. His gun swung toward Ruby, but her father's rifle cracked one final time. The silver-plated revolver went spinning into the dust along with several of Hawkins's fingers. As the marshal's men began disarming and arresting the Iron Riders, Ruby kept her rifle trained on Hawkins. "That was for my father," she said quietly. "And for everyone else you've hurt." The sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. The Iron Riders' reign of terror was ending, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet clicks of handcuffs and the methodical process of justice. Marshal Blake approached Ruby as his deputies led Hawkins away. "Fine shooting," he said, "and even finer planning. Your father would be proud." Ruby lowered her rifle, suddenly tired. "It wasn't just me. The whole town worked together. We just had to be smarter, not faster." The marshal nodded thoughtfully. "Territory could use more folks like you? Ever consider wearing a badge?" Ruby watched as the last of the Iron Riders were led away. In the distance, she could see riders approaching from town, Tucker and the others coming to make sure she was safe. "Maybe," she said finally. "But first I've got a town to help rebuild." The light was almost gone now, but a new day was coming. And for the first time in years, it would dawn on a free territory, thanks to a farm girl who had learned to be not just a good shot, but a leader. 5 years had passed since the fall of the Iron Riders, and Willow Creek had transformed beyond recognition. The once struggling frontier settlement had become a thriving town, its streets bustling with commerce and life. New buildings of brick and stone had replaced many of the old wooden structures, and gardens bloomed where dust had once blown. From her position on the newly built marshal's office porch, Ruby Harper watched the morning activity with quiet satisfaction. At 27, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. The badge on her vest had become as natural as breathing, though she never took its responsibility lightly. "Morning, Marshal Harper," called out familiar voices as townspeople passed by. Children waved excitedly, many of them too young to remember the days when fear had ruled these streets. A tall young man emerged from the gunsmith shop across the street, now expanded into a proper firearms and security consultation business. At 19, Wesley Harper had grown into his father's height and his sister's determined spirit. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. "Another busy day at the shop," he reported, joining Ruby on the porch. 3 more towns sent representatives to learn about our defense programs. Word keeps spreading." Ruby smiled proudly at her brother. After the defeat of the Iron Riders, Wesley had thrown himself into learning everything he could about community defense. Now he helped run what they called the Willow Creek Security School, teaching other towns how to protect themselves. "Speaking of spreading the word," he continued, "the preparations for the anniversary celebration are almost ready. The whole territory's talking about it." The annual celebration of the Iron Riders' defeat had become something far bigger than Willow Creek alone. People came from all over to commemorate not just a victory over bandits, but the moment when ordinary people discovered their power to stand against tyranny. "Mrs. Winters is already baking enough pies to feed an army," Wesley grinned, "and Will's got the younger kids practicing the reenactment again." The thought of the children's enthusiastic portrayal of the battle brought a smile to Ruby's face. They had turned the story into something of a morality play, with the youngest ones taking turns playing the farm girl who stood up to the bandits. Later that afternoon, Ruby visited the town schoolhouse where she regularly taught classes on more than just shooting. Today's lesson was about courage and community. "Remember," she told the eager young faces, "strength isn't just about being able to fight. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for, and being smart about how you protect it." Among her students was young Tommy Reed, whose father had once ridden with the Iron Riders. After Hawkins's defeat, James Reed had surrendered himself to Ruby, seeking a chance to make amends. It hadn't been easy. Many in town had opposed giving him a second chance. But Ruby had remembered something her father once said: "The true test of justice is how we treat those who want to change." 5 years later, James Reed had proven that trust was well placed. He worked as the town stable master, his knowledge of horses and honest labor gradually earning him acceptance in the community. His son Tommy sat proudly in class, no longer bearing the shame of his father's past. That evening, as Ruby walked through the town's newly paved streets, she marveled at how much had changed. The general store where Clara had once hidden frightened townspeople was now the largest trading post in the territory. The church steeple, once her sniper's nest, housed a proper bell that rang out the hours in peaceful celebration. She paused at the town square, where a simple monument stood bearing the names of those who had fought to protect Willow Creek. Silas McCready's name held a place of honor. The old gunsmith had passed peacefully last winter, but his legacy lived on in every person he'd taught to stand tall. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" a voice asked behind her. Ruby turned to find Eleanor Harper, her mother's face lined with pride instead of worry these days. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how far we've come," Ruby admitted. "Your father would be so proud." Eleanor touched the monument gently. "Not just of what you did, but of what you helped others learn to do." They walked together to the family plot on the hill overlooking town. Jedediah Harper's grave was well maintained, with fresh flowers blooming even in the late summer heat. Ruby's special rifle, the one he'd made for her, was mounted above it, retired after that final shot that had ended Hawkins's reign of terror. "The territory's marshal offered me a position again," Ruby said quietly. "Asked me to help organize a larger peacekeeping force." "And what did you tell him?" "That my place is here. Not because I'm afraid to leave, but because this is where I can do the most good. Every person we teach, every town that learns to stand up for itself. That's Pa's legacy living on." As they walked back to town, the setting sun painted Willow Creek in shades of gold and promise. New buildings gleamed. The church bell rang out clear and strong, and the streets were alive with peaceful activity. Children played freely. Merchants chatted with customers on their porches, and everywhere Ruby looked, she saw people standing tall. 5 years ago, a farm girl had stood against tyranny and discovered her true strength. Now that strength had grown into something far bigger than one person or one town. It had become a legacy of hope, a testament to the power of ordinary people standing together. Later that night, as Ruby sat at her desk in the marshal's office finishing reports, a young girl peeked in the door. "Marshal Harper, is it true what they say about how you faced down the whole Iron Riders gang alone?" Ruby smiled, remembering that sunset showdown. "I was never alone," she said quietly. "That was the whole point. True strength isn't in standing alone, it's in standing together." The girl nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question Ruby had heard so many times before. "Will you teach me to be brave like that?" "Come by tomorrow," Ruby said. "I'll teach you something better than bravery. I'll teach you about community, about justice, and about standing true." Outside, the stars shone bright over Willow Creek, each one a point of light in the darkness, just like the courage that lived in every heart that had learned to stand against fear. The Iron Riders were long gone. Their reign of terror faded into history, while Ruby Harper's example lived on, inspiring others to find their own courage, their own strength, their own way to stand true. The legend of the farm girl who stood up to the Iron Riders would live on, not just in history books or celebration days, but in the lasting change she had helped create. A world where ordinary people knew their own strength and used it to protect what mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.